Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
As a grandmother with custody of my grandchild, I feel like I need to vent about my daughter's boyfriend, possibly the most entitled person I've ever met in my life. Everything started about 5 years ago when my daughter met him. He showed up in our state after being kicked out by both his mother and aunt for being a complete deadbeat. Get this, his own mother kept his dog but kicked him out. That should have been our first red flag. When he first arrived, he acted like he was some sort of royalty who deserved everything handed to him on a silver platter. The problem was, he refused to work for any of it. In the past 5 years, he hasn't kept a single job for more than a week. Let me give you some examples of his work ethic. He recently got a job at a grocery store deli. After just 1 week, they didn't immediately promote him to assistant manager. Shocking, right? So he quit. Who expects to become assistant manager after a week? My daughter's friend tried to help him get a job at a construction site. The friend told him all he needed to do was show up wearing safety boots at 7 a.m. on Monday, and the job would be his. It was simple work, just standing there holding a sign that said slow stop. He agreed to show up, but never did. They even gave him a second chance the following week because the friend was sick on the original start date. Still, he didn't show up. When he did food delivery work, he would only do it if my daughter went along with him. He flat out refused to get out of the car, telling my daughter she had to do all the actual delivery work while he just drove. When she protested because she had her own job, he simply said he wouldn't work at all then. Eventually, both their cars got repossessed because, surprise, surprise, they couldn't make the payments. My daughter lost her $25 per hour job because of their drug issues, and now she's cleaning houses as a gig worker. She's their only source of income, but he doesn't seem to care. The state tried to help him once. They put him in a program that provided housing, counseling, and medication. When the program coordinator explained that he needed to attend group counseling sessions to stay in the program, he refused. He said he wouldn't sit around with people he considered beneath him. When told it was mandatory, he simply left the program. And he did. He chose to be homeless rather than follow simple rules or get a job. He even refused to stay in a shelter because it was beneath him. When my daughter was in jail for rehabilitation, he lived on the streets instead of finding work. Everything is always someone else's fault in his mind. He even left a play date with his child because people weren't paying enough attention to him. When I tried to explain that the play date was about his child, not him, he just walked out. He's been charged with domestic violence and child neglect, but they were misdemeanors, so the judge gave him probation. In court, the judge explained he needed to attend therapy and take drug tests as part of his probation. He agreed to the terms but never showed up for any of it. During his week in jail for domestic violence, he constantly called my daughter, begging to be bailed out. He kept insisting that he didn't belong there and needed her to get the money together quickly. She eventually bailed him out, and then he didn't even bother showing up for his court date. The most frustrating part is that he doesn't understand basic cause and effect. It's like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove and act surprised when they get burned. He doesn't grasp that working leads to money, which leads to food and shelter. Recently, he's been avoiding his probation requirements, and it looks like he'll be heading back to jail soon. His probation officer warned him that he'd go back to jail if he didn't meet the requirements. He just complained that the system was against him. When the officer explained he simply needed to show up for therapy and drug testing, he refused to do even that. Right now, my daughter is still with him, cleaning houses to support them both while he sits at home complaining about how unfair life is. Meanwhile, their child is living with me because they couldn't handle the responsibility. I wonder if he'll ever hit rock bottom hard enough to wake up, but at this point, I'm not holding my breath. I'm a first-time mom who had just returned to work after maternity leave. My husband and I had carefully planned everything. I would work from home 3 days a week and go to the office twice. This arrangement meant I could still breastfeed our 4-month-old son while maintaining my career. That day I had a meeting with a client near my favorite cafe. Since I was already out, I figured I'd grab lunch there before heading home. The cafe had always been accommodating to parents with strollers, which was one of the reasons I loved it so much. I stood in line, gently rocking my sleeping baby stroller back and forth. The young barista at the counter recognized me from my frequent visits during my pregnancy and waved. When it was my turn, she smiled and asked if I wanted my usual order. I confirmed and politely requested if they could bring it to my table, explaining that the stroller was tricky to maneuver while carrying food. The barista happily agreed and told me to take my usual spot by the window. That's when I heard an exaggerated scoff behind me. I turned around to see a woman in her 40s, wearing an expensive-looking blazer and tapping her foot impatiently. She immediately started complaining, demanding to know why I was getting table service when this wasn't a restaurant. The barista tried to explain, but Karen interrupted her, declaring that she'd been coming here for years and never received special treatment, adding that having a baby didn't make me more important than other customers. I attempted to explain that it was just a simple courtesy, but she cut me off, ranting about how young mothers think the world revolves around them and their precious babies. I was about to respond when I felt something hit my stroller. This woman had actually kicked it. My baby stirred but thankfully didn't wake up. When I confronted her about kicking my stroller with my baby inside, she dismissed it as barely a tap and told me to stop being dramatic. By now, other customers were watching. Some had their phones out recording the scene. I called her out, telling her that while I'd dealt with entitled people before, kicking a stroller with a sleeping baby was a new low. I asked her if it made her feel powerful to bully new mothers. Several customers chuckled, which only seemed to enrage Karen more. She raised her foot again, but before she could kick the stroller, something unexpected happened. The cafe manager, a woman in her 30s who I'd seen practicing martial arts in the park nearby, seemed to materialize out of nowhere. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Karen's raised foot and used her momentum to flip her onto a nearby empty table. Karen landed with a thud, sending her fancy purse flying. The manager stated the first rule of her cafe, that they don't tolerate violence against anyone, especially babies. Karen started screeching about suing the entire establishment. The manager remained composed, pointing out that their cameras had caught everything, including her assaulting a baby in a stroller. She suggested Karen call her lawyer, saying they'd probably love to see that footage. By now, my baby had woken up and started crying. The manager nodded to one of her staff, who quickly ushered me to a quiet corner of the cafe while she dealt with Karen. Through the commotion, I could hear Karen threatening everyone with lawsuits, while the manager repeated that the police were on their way. When the police arrived, they reviewed the security footage and took statements from multiple witnesses. One of the officers recognized her from a recent incident at a department store where she'd thrown a tantrum over a return policy. They arrested her not just for the stroller incident, but also for violating a public disturbance warning they'd issued her just last week. When they led her out in handcuffs, she was still yelling about lawsuits and discrimination against regular customers. The manager walked over to check on us, telling me everything was on the house and apologizing for the incident, even though none of it was her fault. I was amazed by her takedown and asked where she learned to do that. She explained she had 20 years of Aikido experience, and while she never thought she'd use it at work, she was glad she could help. We ended up chatting for a while. She told me about other entitled customers she'd dealt with, though none had ever gone as far as kicking a baby stroller. I learned later that Karen was charged with assault and disorderly conduct. She tried to countersue the cafe for excessive force, but the security footage and witness statements quickly shut that down. The cafe now has a sign at the entrance. We reserve the right to use martial arts on anyone who kicks baby strollers. I still go there for my coffee, and now I get to tell my baby the story of how the Kung Fu Cafe manager defended his honor. You could call me a good kid. Straight A's, never got into trouble, always honest with my parents. An only child that is quite close to his mom. She worked at a local publishing company, and our family was comfortable enough that we could afford annual vacations. These trips were usually the highlights of my year. Just me, mom, and dad exploring new places together. That changed when I was 14. My mom had gotten close to this new colleague at work over the past year. He was in his late 30s, married with no kids, and honestly, something about him just made me uncomfortable. You know that feeling when someone's trying way too hard? He'd always crack these forced jokes whenever he saw me, try to high-five me, and call me kiddo in this weird way that made my skin crawl. I remember the day my mom brought up the vacation idea. We were having dinner, and she seemed really excited about it. She asked me what I thought about having her colleague and his wife join us for our beach trip that summer. I told her I didn't think it was a good idea. When she asked why not, insisting they were such fun people, I tried to explain that I just didn't feel comfortable around him and something about him felt off. My dad jumped in, telling me to give them a chance, since my mom said they were great company. I insisted again that I really didn't want to go, emphasizing that he made me uncomfortable. But my mom just dismissed my concerns, telling me not to be silly and that he was just trying to be friendly, assuring me it would be fun. And just like that, my concerns were dismissed. The vacation went ahead as planned, and while nothing explicitly bad happened, I spent the entire week feeling on edge, trying to avoid being alone with him. His constant attempts to be cool with me, suggesting we go swimming together, wanting to teach me surfing, trying to include me in adult conversations, only made me more uncomfortable. Fast forward to last week. I'm now 28, married, with a family of my own. We were having dinner at my parents' house and somehow the conversation turned to a recent movie about child abuse. My mom, who was particularly moved by the film, made this big speech about how, if anything ever happened to us, we could have always come to her, claiming she would have believed us and protected us. After all these years, the memory of that vacation and how my feelings were dismissed still stung. I told her that what she was saying wasn't true. When she asked what I meant, I reminded her about when I was 14 and told her I was uncomfortable with her colleague going on vacation with us. She acted confused, asking which colleague I meant. I explained it was the one who kept trying to be cool with me, pointing out that I had literally told her I didn't feel comfortable around an adult man, and she had completely ignored me. She claimed she didn't remember that incident. I insisted that I did, explaining how I had explicitly said I didn't want him there, and that something felt off about him. I asked her what if there had been more serious reasons for my discomfort. What if something had happened to me before that I was too scared to tell her about, wondering aloud if she would have ignored that too. The color drained from my mom's face. My dad, who had been quietly listening, looked equally shocked. My mom tried to stammer out that she never thought about it that way, saying she just thought I was being a typical teenager. I pointed out that was exactly the problem. She never thought about it, never really listened, and now she was sitting there claiming she would have always believed me. My dad tried to defend her, starting to say she didn't mean to, but I cut him off. I acknowledged that I knew she didn't mean to, but explained that was the problem. They both assumed they knew better than me about my own feelings of safety, just like what happens in so many of these cases with adults thinking they know better and dismissing children's concerns as silly or dramatic. The silence that followed was deafening. My mom started crying, which wasn't my intention, but I couldn't back down. This needed to be said. Through her tears, she apologized, saying she had failed me as a mother. I told her I didn't need her to feel guilty, explaining that I needed her to understand why what she did was wrong, and to actually mean it when she said she'd listen to children. I pointed out that her current claims about always believing me rang hollow when we both knew she hadn't. That conversation changed something in our relationship. My mom later told me she spent days reflecting on other times she might have dismissed my feelings, and she's been making a genuine effort to be more attentive not just with me, but with my children as well. It's not perfect, but it's a start. I've been working at an animal shelter for the past 5 years, and it's given me a pretty good perspective on both the best and worst of pet ownership. The number of abandoned animals we get is heartbreaking, but what's even worse is when people try to justify their abandonment as something noble. That's exactly what happened last week with my coworker from my part-time job at the coffee shop. We weren't close, but we'd chat during shifts and occasionally grab lunch together. She'd gotten a cat about 6 months ago, and I'd seen plenty of pictures of the little orange tabby on her social media. During our shared lunch break, she started telling me about how she'd rehomed her cat the previous weekend. I was curious since she hadn't mentioned having any issues with the cat before. She explained that she couldn't deal with the cat anymore because it kept peeing on her bed. When I asked if she'd taken it to the vet, suggesting it might be a medical issue, she dismissed the idea. She told me she wasn't going to waste hundreds of dollars on vet bills, and she was convinced the cat was just being spiteful. When I questioned her about what she meant by spiteful, she insisted that the cat knew it would upset her and was doing it on purpose. Then she proudly launched into her explanation of the rehoming process. The more she spoke, the more horrified I became. She described how the previous Saturday she had put the cat in its carrier and left it outside an upscale salon downtown before they opened. Her voice was cheerful as she explained that she figured someone there would take it. She told me she'd driven by later that afternoon to check, and the carrier was gone. According to her, when she asked around, she'd heard that one of the hairstylists had taken it home. My years of shelter work flashed through my mind. All the abandoned animals we'd taken in, the ones left in boxes, carriers, or just thrown out on the street. When I told her that what she'd done wasn't rehoming but abandonment, she got defensive. I explained that real rehoming involves finding a suitable owner beforehand, checking their living situation, and making sure they understand the responsibility. I pointed out that she had simply dumped her cat and gotten lucky that someone kind had found it. Her face turned red as she slammed her hand on the table. She lashed out at me for judging her, arguing that the cat had found a home and she'd made sure to leave it somewhere safe. I questioned what might have happened if no one had taken it, if someone cruel had found it instead, or if it had gotten loose. She got even angrier, retorting that none of those things had happened. She accused me of being self-righteous because of my shelter work, sneering that not everyone could be perfect like me. I pulled out my phone and showed her our shelter's website. I pointed out the cases from just the previous month. 3 cats left in carriers outside stores, 2 of them pregnant. I explained that we have resources for people who need to rehome their pets, and we could have helped her find a proper home or even assisted with the vet bills if that was the issue. She dismissed my explanation with a curt comment about not needing a guilt trip and stormed off. But I wasn't done. I went to our manager and reported what she'd done, explaining that it's illegal in our city to abandon animals. I also posted about the incident in our local pet community group, warning the salon to check their security cameras. Turns out they had footage of her leaving the carrier. The salon owner was furious when she found out. She'd been wondering who had left the cat, as one of her employees had indeed taken it home. She called the police and filed a report. My co-worker ended up getting fined for animal abandonment, and our manager fired her after learning about the incident. The hairstylist who took the cat decided to keep it, and from what I've heard, the cat is doing much better now. No inappropriate urination issues at all. Probably because the stylist actually took it to a vet who diagnosed and treated a urinary tract infection. These days, whenever I see my former co-workers' social media posts complaining about how unfair everything was and how she was just trying to help the cat, I simply scroll past. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.